We're going to hear two parables this week from Mark's Gospel from chapter 4. Two parables about sowing and seeds that I'd like us to listen to together and to think about how they relate to each other. And as we do so, maybe to have in mind a third parable, the really well-known parable of the sower, the first parable in Mark's Gospel, and one that heads up this section of Mark's Gospel, and which you could call the parable about parables, the one that sets the theme for this whole section of Mark's Gospel. So let's listen from chapter 4 and verses 26 to 32. Jesus also said, "The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground, and would sleep and rise night and day, and the seed would sprout and grow. He does not know how. The earth produces of itself first the stalk, then the head, then the full grain in the head. But when the grain is ripe, at once he goes in with his sickle, because the harvest time has come." He also said, "With what can we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable will we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, which, when sown upon the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds on earth. Yet when it is sown, it grows up and becomes the greatest of all shrubs, and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the air can make nests in its shade." Now, I wonder if you get that sense, as I do, that here are three parables that are really quite different. Obviously, there is that similarity. They're all about seeds and growth. They are quite different, but they're actually structured in a remarkably similar way in three different phases, you could say. And you could identify those three different phases in each of the parables. And the first is the image of sowing. In the parable of the sower goes out to sow the seed, to broadcast it, that word that we borrow for radio waves going out, or a program being broadcast out into the world, but that sense of the seed simply being scattered out upon the ground. And that same image of seed on the ground is there in both of the parables, and it's very specific, though less elaborate. The kingdom of God is as if someone would scatter seed on the ground. Or again, with what can we compare the kingdom of God, or what parable? It is like a mustard seed which, when sown upon the ground. And so can you see how all the three parables begin with that sense of seed being sown on the ground? That assurance that the seed is there, even though, of course, once sown, it is soon lost in the soil and disappears from sight very often. The third and final step, I'm skipping over the middle one. Again, do you hear a similarity? That in the parable of the sower, we have the assurance of the harvest, which is 40-fold, 80-fold, 100-fold of what is sown. Yeah, there will be an abundant harvest. With the first of today's two parables again, and the one who plants the seed will go out with their sickle, and it will be harvest time, and the harvest will be there. In the last of the parables, the mustard seed is not one of reaping harvest, but of a tree which, through its branches, provides a habitat, provides a home for the birds and the animals. It's a different image, but I think it has the same point, that the provision of the kingdom will be abundant, and it will be nourishing and sustaining, and it will be a place where we can be at home. And so all three parables begin and end in a very similar way. And so what of the middle section? And I do feel when you hear these three parables together, it is to the middle section in particular that we are drawn. The middle section in the parable of the sower, which of course we've not heard read, but we will know, I think, really quite well, is that discovery that the seed will fall in different places, and in some places it will not flourish. It will either get eaten or it will grow up quickly and then be burnt by the sun or whatever it might be. But there is a sense of helplessness of the sower once the seed is sown. Although the harvest may be guaranteed, nonetheless, the sower is helpless as the ground either does or does not produce a harvest. In the final parable that we had, that middle section is so brief it's almost invisible because the seed is planted and then there's the great tree at the end. But nonetheless, there is that sense of, there is a moment of growth, of course, which is, I say, just passed over really quickly. But in the middle parable, that sense of helpless watching, of inert watching, of simply being there to watch, I think is particularly focused. And it's brought out by the way in which Jesus, as the storyteller, talks about how, first of all, the shoot, and then the ear, and then the grain in the ear, and we're being drawn into that sense that every gardener or farmer will be all too familiar with, that sense of simply waiting for nature to do its thing, and to be in that moment really quite helpless. The sower does not know. It's something that it has to be handed over entirely to God. And so as I hear these three parables together, it is into that middle section, maybe ringing bells with us when in our own living, whether in our Christian living or our general living, we have that sense of helplessness, of simply being observers of what's going on, of being swept along by circumstance, by the world, and by its reaction to us. But that's set very firmly within that frame of, on the one hand, the seed is definitely sown, and at the end, the harvest will definitely come. And so this is ultimately, all three of them are parables of encouragement, to encourage, to persist, even in those moments of helplessness. And I think there's a particular profound theological point that this makes, because these parables, it seems to me, are not only about us and how we might experience that middle section. Maybe all of our Christian lives is lived out in that middle section between the sowing and the harvest. But that Jesus himself, of course, is the sower of the seed of the kingdom. And so Jesus, as the Son of God, is equally brought into that moment of passiveness, of passivity, of simply being the observer, the one who waits with us for the moment of harvest. And surely there's a profound theological message in there that God is both the one who assures that the seed is sown and the harvest will come at either end, but also the one in Jesus who is there in that particularly human experience of simply having to be the patient observers of how God's purposes are working out. This isn't a parable, I don't think, to suggest that we can all sit back and just wait for things to happen. But it is a set of parables, I think, which encourages us to a particular faith perspective, where we know in our moments of frustration and inaction that actually God waits with us and the harvest is assured.